Welcome everyone to TRG 30. I gave us a few extra minutes so that I could see the wonderful words that you're using to describe your organization's event budgeting process. I'm Jill Robinson. Thank you, Stephen, for getting us started with everyone being involved, and that's going to want to continue. Stephen will be here. Put your thoughts as we go through today's conversation in chat. Use the Q&A function for questions that he and I will be answering with you about budgeting and event budgeting, which is part of the bold change for our sector's resilience and TRG 30. Happy morning, afternoon, and evening to all of you. Today's conversation is about becoming a prediction wizardry. We all need a little bit of magic right now. And today it's in regard to, as I said, budgeting specifically, but more specifically, accurate budgeting. Your words, I don't think included the word accurate, although important was a big word that came up. There were also words like wishful, copy and paste. I loved amorphous, been anxious, last minute, tedious, all of these things that we feel about this annual, sometimes one-time event process, but critical and important, as you've identified, and critical to our resiliency, especially if we're able to develop accurate projections within a margin of error here. We're going to talk about that. Budget projections that can lead to hitting revenue expectations, exceeding them, enabling us to invest in the right ways, fueling our sector's resiliency for now and into 2032, as I'm always want to talk about. Okay, so Stephen will be with us alongside as we go. We'll have questions at the end, and you're going to be engaged. In fact, let's get to the things that I want you to be thinking about. One of them I'm going to be asking you about at the end. The first is this. When your organization or you are engaged in the budgeting process, do you have an expense or an investment mindset when budgeting? An expense or an investment mindset when budgeting? When we're budgeting for revenue, but we're also budgeting for the expense that fuels it. Think about your mindset, your organization's mindset when that practice is taking place, and reflect on the general sort of culture that exists in your head or in your organization. Second is this. When budgets are set and achieved, or when budgets are set and they're not achieved, rather, what happens? What happens to the action? What happens to the dialogue? What happens to the feeling in the hallway or on Zoom? What happens when it doesn't work the way you anticipated? And finally, this is the one I'm going to be asking you about at the end. What do you think your organization would do differently? What would your organization do differently if everyone knew that you could consistently forecast your income? Okay, so those words we were using, thank you for those. When we're projecting revenues, I think I saw the word opaque in there. This building a budget sometimes can make us feel like we need a crystal ball. And right now, especially, I think that's true as we're emerging from the biggest crisis we've seen ever in recent history that has hit our sector so hard. But a crystal ball is not going to get at it for us. Neither is our gut instinct, really. Gut feelings. I've been doing this a long time. My gut feelings too don't produce repeatable and accurate results. If any of you in this room have experienced missing on expected revenue, either by falling short or ahead, I wonder if you've considered the implications of either of those. What are the negative consequences of either of those outcomes? If we underachieve consistently, we know what that feels like. We risk losing credibility with teams, we maybe create creative limitations for the rest of the season. We might even start talking about expense cuts, staff cuts, morale sinks, scarcity starts to sink or creep in. And if we overachieve, and if it becomes regular overachievement, even though it can feel like a win to start, it also can mean a shift in morale, a belief that we're sandbagging. More importantly, it can mean missed opportunities, opportunities to right size how we're investing at the beginning of the season. It gives us a skewed sense of what success is. Neither of these options are what we're striving for. Perfection will never happen, but these over under, wouldn't it be great if we could have a margin of error between 1% and 5% as opposed to a 10% or a 20 or a 40% margin of error when we get to the end of a season. The good news here is we don't need a crystal ball, but what we do need is the magic of data. So let's look first at the metric we're really trying to get our hands on when we talk about revenue projections. The metric is this. It's demand. Okay, get your chat fingers ready here. I'm going to read this definition. Demand is the amount of a good or service that consumers are willing to buy at a particular price. Put in chat for me, which of these words is the most important word when we're thinking about demand? I'm going to read it again. The amount of a good or service that consumers are willing to buy at a particular price. Willing to. Aha. Consumers, price, willing to. Aha. So as you're picking up on this willing to language, I think you're getting at the word that I would say we need to start with, and it's this word: amount, volume. It ties to what are consumers willing to do? What is the volume? How likely is volume to be at a certain level? That's where becoming a prediction wizard starts. So let's talk a little bit more about that. When we're talking about demand, first, we live in a time that we've got to separate out into two eras, really. Pre-pandemic time. So first, you want to segment your data, your historical box office or visitor admission or whatever it is that we're trying to project on data. Pre-pandemic, 3 to 5 years. Look at that differently than your current year data. And even to this point, in team conversations and in my own client work, we see a wide variation of results right now in 2022. Some of you are experiencing levels of demand that look similar to 2019 and are happy about it and should be asking questions about it like, is that sustainable? Why is that happening? Is it because of pent-up demand? Is that going to continue into 23, 24? Or you might be on the other end of the spectrum. We have not recovered. What does the data say as it relates to our current data, which I've characterized as 2020, 2021, and the 2022 cycle we're in now? Is it starting to grow in volume? How does it compare to pre-pandemic volume? Have you had discussions about the variables that are driving or not driving and what that means to what you might be able to expect? That's first step. Pre-pandemic, current. The second is making sure that you're looking at unit sales, not revenue. Revenue will come later, but gone must be the day of us saying, we think we can achieve 3, 5, I've heard stories, 20% increases on revenue without first doing the hard and important work of looking at the amount of volume we think we can predict or project. Units, pre-pandemic and current. That's the first step. The second then is to look at the type of production and programming data that you have. Now, many of you, not all, but many of you have what we're calling an annual production. This is the kind of production that you're doing every year. So probably that happens most often in the December holiday period. If you're a symphony orchestra like pictured here, it would be your annual Messiah production, December holiday pops concerts perhaps. If you're a dance company, that's Nutcracker, it would be Panto in the UK, Christmas Carol. That type of production wants to be siloed off, and the volume of units sold pre and post-pandemic or pre-pandemic and current want to be organized in that context. So annual productions, pre and current. And then we've got to look at current season, or rather regular season productions. And again, this will depend on your own business model. If you're a dance company, you would want to bucket and organize these productions into things like mixed rep and full length. If you're a big receiving house business model or presenter, it would be by type of genre of art form that you're presenting. If theater, it's Shakespeare versus musicals. You get the point. Organizing that by production type, again, pre-pandemic, current, to look and see how are unit sales performing now, how have they performed historically. So with those two layers, you're seeing there's variation, nuance, information that will help you predict revenues in 23, 24 for the rest of the season, perhaps better if you move from aggregated ticket sales data, certainly not revenue, aggregated ticket sales data to segmented ticket sales data. But there's one more layer here, and that layer is the who. So let's take the Nutcracker example as one. We have pre-pandemic Nutcracker unit history. We've launched and implemented, performed Nutcracker last year and are selling it for this year. Now the third layer is who. Who attended Nutcracker pre-pandemic? What proportion of that was your current audience? What proportion of it was new? Same question for in the current sort of pandemic era. What's the distribution of types of people? Where do they live? Where did they live then? Where do they live now? Who are they? These layers in 2022 are absolutely required for you to make the best possible predictions about what your revenue streams are going to look like moving forward. And what one example we know from clients and from our benchmarking work is that none of us have attracted new patrons at anything close to the levels we used to. What does that mean? Do you know what proportion of current patrons are attending today and what proportion are new? And what does that mean to your future predictions and revenue forecasts? Each of these layers will help you create a picture of demand for each of the productions that you would have in the next year or 18-month cycle. Segmenting units based on era, program type, and the type of patron that's in the room or likely to be in the room. That yields a final formula, and finally, we are going to talk about revenue. So first, we're going to project using that data, the expected units sold on a per production basis. Who's in the room? Why do we think so? Because we've done all this work. Then, now finally, we're going to look at ticket yield. Now, this is a TRG 30 of its own. But for right now, for simplicity's sake, the question you should be asking yourself is there a reason that our patrons next year in the future will be paying the same, more, less than what they paid last cycle? And so if your average ticket yield was $54 or 28 pounds. Is that likely to be the same next year for simple math? Or will you be adjusting pricing? Will you be adjusting where inventory is that has an impact on ticket yield? Again, longer conversation, its own strategy, but this is the first time that we're talking about an element that really affects the final revenue piece of the pie here. Putting those elements together gets our expected ticket revenue, a very different process than saying we generated 5.2 million pounds last year. I think we should be able to generate 8% next year. Here's why. The math matters on the front end. Now, using this math enables us these more accurate predictions. And by doing this, we can come to this place that I talked about at the beginning, that is more accurate, more attainable, and then can inform decisions around investment. And I use this word investment intentionally here. The reason we do all this work to create this accurate look is not just to get the wizard hat, although, boy, anything that offers more informed decision-making today is really, it's required, and it's going to be a huge gift to your organization, your executive leaders, or your board if you are an executive leader. But what comes out of this kind of margin of error that's narrow, this enables strategic thinking, investing, and results toward resiliency. By taking these steps, it enables your leaders to see what's real and then right size decisions and frameworks around investment for the coming year and years moving forward. I want to, for a moment, though, to go back to this question I asked you and talk a little bit about the difference. I think it's worth taking a minute to define what I and we mean by expense and investment and that mindset. The expense mindset is going to have you and your team, you'll hear language about things like the marketing and other expenses are necessary costs of doing business. It focuses or tends to focus on the current fiscal year, short term, focus on costs that fit into that necessary category. And when that's the mindset, it discourages doing more. It focuses on doing just enough to hit budgets, just enough. Let's pay just enough salary to keep just enough people on staff to do just enough to meet our numbers. Let's be thrifty in how and what we put on stage. It's a scarcity mindset. This expense side mindset thinks about costs. This costs us money, but we have to do it. Investment mindset is different. It sees the intentional choice within this necessary cost, but of course there are. We have to pay staff, we have to make decisions about how much we're going to spend. But there are choices within that reality. And the investment mindset teams and leaders think longer term. They focus on investments that made now can pay back next year and the year after and the year after. And instead of asking the question, how much do I have to spend? The question is, how much can I spend to maximize returns? This is the thing. How much can an investment return versus how much will it cost us? This kind of investment makes us money. It sounds simple in theory. We know it's not. We know that this is how the process tends to flow and go. Executives tend to have an idea about how much they're going to need, what the expense side is going to require. They might have written it down. They certainly have a framework, and then they invite departmental leaders to participate. And departmental leaders do a lot of what I've described previous here. And then the executive comes back and says, ooh, I've got edits. We're going to need cuts. We're going to need more revenue. This is how it typically goes. But even if you're not an executive leader, you can argue for a different approach, one that puts the data at the center of decision making, one that says, please let me inform how you're planning. And then this is presented, and then executives can make decisions, ideally with an investment mindset, and set all manner of financial targets accordingly. Even if you're in the first row of action and culture, you can insert yourself into a process and make an iterative process that gets a better result. And that is, yes, we want you to use data, but communicating. If you're an executive leader, sit at the table with your teams and talk about whether or not what you're seeing in the data, whether or not the projections that you've set are likely to be achieved. And if you're exceeding targets, have conversation about, can we invest more? What would it enable and unlock in our organization? This nimble kind of regular work is something that you've got to get good at today and moving forward. It's part of the resilient culture that will help move our sector past this time and toward recovery. And look, if you need data for sure, and you need benchmarked data, and today there's no reason to not have it. Our COVID Sector 19 benchmark enables you to look at your own data compared to a region in industry. There's all kinds of information available, not least of which what we're seeing in sales pacing. In the US, when you look at revenue and units, let's forget revenue for a moment and just look at units. What we're seeing is that pacing is starting later and ending much nearer to the event itself. In the UK, it's slightly different because the West End and the commercial sector behaves a little differently than that. What do you know about your data? Are you sharing it? Are you talking about it? How are you using it to make investments? So as Stephen is joining us and taking your questions, he's going to come off mute. We're going to answer them, but put in chat for me, what would your organization do if you knew you were going to be more accurate? What would you do differently? How would you think differently if you knew you were within a thinner or a closer margin of error in your forecasts and revenue projections? Stephen, welcome.
Thanks, Jill. Alan has asked a question, and Jill, I wonder if you'd riff on this, which is, so many leaders, board members, bean counters seem to concentrate expense discussions on ratios, spending X% of revenue to attract revenue. Why do you believe, Jill, that we can't break this habit? Why haven't we broken this habit?
Well, they do that, and that habit isn't necessarily bad unless it's fixed and locked and immovable, right, Alan? You know, if we have Nutcracker, we want to spend an amount to generate income based on what we've seen in the past. But this nimble action, if we're pacing well, then we should be spending more. So the ratio, I don't think, is the problem. I think the organizational behavior is the problem. The investment mindset, having it or not, is the issue. That's my knee-jerk take.
There's still time to put your question in the Q&A button. The one thing I just want to add here is that we have, if you want to dig in deeper to this, there is a Talent Lab workshop that delves into this over a 2-hour session. If you were at TRG 30 a couple of weeks ago, you'll have heard Kerry talk about arming you with the skills and professional development in order to accelerate results, right? And so Talent Lab, I've dropped the link in. There's a session that you can sign up to here. Mitch has just asked a question around this benchmark data and what we're seeing. And to answer your question, Mitch, yes, we're seeing that ticket sales, particularly in the US, are moving. There's this initial early on sale and then this late demand cycle that is different to the UK at the moment. And Jill, the US is recovering differently from the pandemic compared to the UK, right?
Yeah, I just came back from England, as you know. The UK, regardless of what we think about public policy, the UK has had a different container for it, and they are recovering faster. Even outside of the West End with regional producers, the last minute nature is different and looks much more similar to pre-pandemic data. The US, you've seen, Canadian data has an even slower cycle. slower to move, much more last minute. And as we know, their public policy decisions have been very different than in the US and the UK. Looking at your data, benchmarking your data against your peers, therein lies the magic, the nimble action and review.
Jill, a question, what guidance do you have for marketing staff with limited authority to challenge leadership to think realistically rather than idealistically about revenue projections? Also about the cost of marketing, especially for a new project without historical precedent.
Yeah,
boy,
I know.
I remember this as a marketing director. I remember this.
Yeah, boy. Well, I just saw Ben's comment too. This ratio bit, I may not have been getting at the intention behind Alan's question, and we could have a conversation about this. But what we know is that there is a relationship between how much we spend and how much we earn. And looking at that historically helps provide a guidepost. It's not the final answer. It just isn't. And there isn't often an answer when something is brand new. So if it's brand new and I'm the marketing director, I'm going to look back to see what happened when we spent on brand new programming, which tends to require more. It does tend to require more to create awareness of something that is completely unknown. And so the investment required is going to be different. And yet those patrons, having experienced it, will they come back? Do they come back at a different rate than the people who attend big blockbusters? All of this math plays into how much we're willing to spend and invest to generate the income.
I think a last question at the end of time from Anthony. The process of convincing board members to come over to the investment mindset versus expense after they've had several years of deficit year on year. Yeah. I'm a new ED, I'm identifying several areas of need of improvement, but hitting some roadblocks on convincing them that this will help our bottom line.
Yeah, this I think ties back to the first part of the other question. Right now, how do we move away from fear? Because that's the fear is that we'll spend money and it won't return. And again, this is where data in a benchmark that points to possibility, it's happening here. Let's understand why it's happening here and make decisions that test and learn accordingly. So benchmarking so that you understand what's happening elsewhere, setting up experiments. So don't ask a board or a wary executive leader to go all in, take one risk, make one investment, measure the results, measure the return, and then rinse, whatever the metaphor is, recycle and repeat. So those are two thoughts that I have.
Oh, thank you, Jill. And thank you for the great questions. Don't forget, you can dig in more here with our Talent Lab session on hitting your revenue goals. Find out more at the link there. We'll be back in 2 weeks. Give us your feedback after today's session. You'll see our MPS survey pop up. We read all of your comments and take those into account with future planning. Good luck all, and we'll see you again soon.
Thanks, everyone. Bye-bye.